Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Norman. I am a fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. 10 years ago today, Tunisia was in the midst of its uprising. It was just over a week later, on January 14th, 2011, that former Tunisian President Ben Ali fled the country for Saudi Arabia. On January 15th, Tunisian state TV announced to the public that Ben Ali had formally resigned his position. And on that same day, Larbi Siddiqui of the University of Exeter wrote in an article for Al Jazeera, quote, "The winds of uncertainty blowing in the Arab West, Maghreb, threaten to blow eastward toward the Levant, as the marginalized issue the fatalistic scream of despair to be given freedom in bread or death," end quote. This prophetic statement proved true. On January 25th, Egypt began its 18-day uprising that would topple President Mubarak. And we would also see uprisings in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, as well as major protests in Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, Kuwait, Oman, and Sudan. Today is the first in a two-part webinar series, looking at the 10-year anniversary of the 2011 Arab uprisings. Today's webinar will focus on youth, protest, and governance, while the second webinar to be held next week examines geopolitics and changing alliances in the Middle East and North Africa region. Today's panelists all wear several hats, but a common thread is that they're all experts on Arab public opinion data. We'll ask these experts to revisit the original demands of the 2011 protesters. Perhaps we all remember slogans like Aish Horeya, Adala Iktmaya, or bread, freedom, and social justice from the Egyptian uprising. Were these demands met? How did regimes respond to these demands? Or if they did not, how have they maneuvered and recalibrated? And how do nationals of countries in the region feel about the original demands of the protests today, 10 years later? So I'll take just a few minutes now to introduce our speakers, and then I'll hand it over to each panelist to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. After that, we'll open it up for questions that you in the audience can submit via the chat feature. Our first speaker is Sunil John, who is founder of ASTA BCW and president, Middle East, of BCW, the region's leading PR consultancy. He is also on the global board of BCW, a top 3 global PR agency. Additionally, he leads Proof Communications, a specialist digital and design firm, and PSB Research ME that offers research-based consultancy for campaigns in the region. John has been the driver behind the annual ASTA BCW Arab Youth Survey, a unique thought leadership initiative started in 2008, and currently one of the most widely cited pieces of public opinion research on the region by media and policymakers across the world. Our second speaker is Dr. Amani Jamal, who is the Edwards Sanford Professor of Politics at Princeton University and director of the BOPS Center for Peace and Justice. Jamal also directs the workshop on Arab political development in the BOPS American University of Beirut Collaborative Initiative. Her books include Barriers to Democracy, The Other Side of Social Capital in Palestine and the Arab World, Of Empires and Citizens, Pro-American Democracy or No Democracy at All, and her co-edited volume, Race and Arab Americans Before and After 9/11, From Invisible Citizens to Visible Subjects. She is also the co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer project, which conducted more than 70,000 interviews over 5 waves of surveys across 15 countries in the MENA region since 2006. And our final speaker is Dr. Shibli Talhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He regularly conducts public opinion polls in the Arab world, Israel, and the United States. His books include The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East, The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989 to 2011, and The Stakes, America in the Middle East. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Sunil John, our first speaker.
Thank you, Kelsey. I wanted to thank you to the Rice University's Baker Institute of Public Policy for organizing this webinar, very timely, especially since it's the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, or the Arab Uprising as it's popularly known. I think, as Kelsey said, it was quite a small little incident that sparked off, this huge uprising across several of these countries, across the vast Middle East and North Africa region. A Tunisian street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, set himself on fire just in front of a government office in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. And that set off a huge revolutionary movement that got a lot of people, especially the youth, on the streets. And it kind of rippled across this vast Arab world, which is otherwise called the Middle East and North Africa, and toppled a huge number of long-standing authoritarian regimes. 10 years down the line, and that's why this webinar is so important, when you really look at it, those uprisings produced some modest political, social, and economic gains for the region's citizens. But they also sparked some really horrific and lasting violence, mass displacements, and worsening repression across many parts of the region. And as many of us know, 2019, just before the year of the pandemic, there were a large number of youth uprisings, especially in countries such as Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq, and that actually it was defined as Arab Spring 2.0. So the revolution or the uprisings continue, and some of the main reasons why those uprisings happen continue to stay relevant in this region. As Kelsey said, we go out into the field and do an Arab youth survey, something we started way back in 2008, much before the Arab Spring. So when it's an interesting story, because we went and did this survey because the Arab world is one of the youngest in the world. 60% of the population below the age of 30. This is the youngest region in the world. And if you want to understand the region, you need to understand the hearts and minds of these young people. And that's why we do the Arab Youth Survey every year. But I must tell you that when we did this survey in the years 8, 9, and 10, nobody noticed our survey. We would come out with results. People said, okay, they're doing a research, but we did it essentially because the region was data poor. And we said we needed to bring something to help governments and private sector to understand the largest demographic of the region. But in 2011, everybody started looking at our survey and looking at what these young people have been saying. And that's why we call, I'm here to actually give you some facts and figures of what these young people are saying. And we call it a voice for change. And I have some results for you from 2018 and 2020, recently from the region, and that will make our discussions even more interesting. If you could go to the next slide, please. So before we go into the main findings, I wanted to tell you that the survey is done by our sister company, PSB, which is a US-based research analytics firm, which is a sister company of BCW. In 2020, we did 4,000 face-to-face interviews. These are not online interviews. These are face-to-face. So it's much more difficult to go out into the field and talk to these young people. We talk to young people in the age group of 18 to 24. The sample is 50% male, 50% female, and we go into 17 Arab countries. And as you can see, they are split between GCC, Levant, and North Africa. This year, we did this in the months of February and March, and then the COVID hit us, and we wanted to make sure that we capture some of the COVID findings, and we wanted to see if things have changed. And so we went back into the field in August of 2020, August 18th to 26th, in a smaller sample to see how things have changed. So the results of 2020, which is all available in the public domain, arabyouthsurvey.com, you will find all of those results there. So that's the methodology we use. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to, before I get to the 2020 findings, especially on the Arab Spring, I wanted to give you some figures of the survey we did in 2018. That was the 10th anniversary of our survey. And there were some specific questions we asked to young people about how they see the Arab world and the impact of some big developments. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see following our question, we asked young people during the last 10 years, this remember is a question asked in 2018, during the last 10 years, what did they see as the biggest issues that the region faced? And clearly, I think the number one, these were multiple choices. Number one impact was the rise of the terrorist group Daesh, or ISIS as they are known. And the second most important impact was the Arab Spring. This is 2018. And when we asked them, how do you see the Arab Spring, as a positive or a negative development, 56% of the sample across the countries, in that year we went only to 15 countries, but covered most of the main countries across the Gulf, Levant, and North Africa, said that the Arab Spring was a negative development, 20% positive, and about 24% neutral. If you go to the next slide, we went specifically looked at the four Arab Spring countries as they are known, and you can see the question whether it's a positive or negative development. You can see the responses are very, very polarized. You can see Egypt and Yemen, 52% in Egypt think of it as a negative development, while in Yemen it's roughly about can't see this full slide here, but it's about 50%. So as you can see, that's they look at it as a negative development, while in Tunisia, which is probably the country which has had the most dividend from the Arab Spring, 50% of the young people feel that that's a positive development. And Libya, at that time in 2018, in the throes of the post-Gaddafi era, 42% felt that it was positive. But it is pretty polarized. Now moving on to 2020, from the findings of our latest survey, and here, as you know, in 2019, Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq were four countries that, if you go to the next slide, were four countries where there was a lot of protests on the street. And as I said, that was kind of defined as Arab Spring 2.0. And all of those four countries saw change in leadership. Lebanon, Saad Hariri had to leave. It is an irony that he's back now. Algeria, President Bouteflika had to stop from contesting the election. President Bashir in Sudan was put in jail. And in Iraq, there was a change in the prime ministership as well. So as you can see, those four protest countries as well had change in regime. But then when we asked the question, again, if you go to the next slide, we asked, what were the main reasons for the social unrest and the protests? And look at the first finding. It is 40% said corruption and bad governance. That was the number one reason why young people across the 17 countries felt the protests were happening. And of course, the second one, equally important, nearly 30%, lack of quality jobs. Now, that's the reason why mostly youth-driven protests in these four countries, that was the reason for the main catalyst for the protests happening there. Moving forward to the next slide, we asked young people why, in terms of the view of their government in their country, 77% across the 17 countries felt that there is government corruption in their country. But when you look at the three regions, Levant, nearly 99% felt so, 95% in North Africa, but in the oil-rich Gulf countries, much less, because there was much more reason for young people having jobs and the governments taking care of their social and their future needs as well. So you can see that, while you see a 77%, there are nuanced differences in those three regions. If you go to the next slide, here we asked again the question, now thinking of the next 10 years, which of the following is the most important thing for the Arab world to address? And as you can see, the young people said, cracking down on government corruption. And that is considered, 36% said that's what the government should tackle. And again, creating new, well-paying jobs was the second reason. So, what are these young people saying? They're saying that tackle this. There is a famous word in the Arab world. It's called wasta, and that means influence. That means these young people who get jobs get through Vasta. So they want to get that whole ecosystem of Vasta away so that they get opportunity. That's what these young people are looking at. When the Arab Spring happened in 2011, most of it was about opportunities, about dignity. But that changed very fast when young people started focusing on the here and now, on the kitchen table issues, on jobs, on being able to start a family. So, people became more realistic about what the Arab Spring could do for them. So when you look at 2020, when the young people are frustrated with government corruption, especially in areas in North Africa and the Levant, what is that leading to? And the next slide will show you what that means. 42% of the sample said that they are considering emigrating to another country. Now that is a huge red flag, not only to the Arab governments, because young people, which is the wealth of any country, are wanting to go away because they are not seeing, they're seeing, it is a huge sign of the failure of the Arab Spring, that this movement, this revolution that started in 11, didn't really deliver for them. And these are numbers that are all there. You look at World Bank numbers, youth unemployment in the Middle East is the highest in the world, 30%. So, some of these problems that happened continue to worry these young people. And what do? They say, let's look at an opportunity outside of the region. And that would not only a red flag for the Arab governments, but also a red flag for a number of countries, especially in Europe, where there'll be pressure on the borders. But where is that feeling coming from? When you nuance those numbers and dig a little deeper, you see Levant, 63%. Those are the young people who want to emigrate, not surprising. North Africa, about 47%, but much less in the GCC at about 13%. If you go to the next slide, we asked these young people, why do you want to emigrate? What's the main reason? Look at that, economic reasons, inability to get opportunity and jobs, corruption in my country. Those are the top two reasons why young people want to emigrate. So looking forward, if you go to the next slide, and here you look at, if you go to the next slide again, we look at, which of the following are closer to your view in terms of would young people, do they see themselves as having a better life than their parents? Now, this is a very depressing slide for me, because while you see a number of the countries on the left saying that 74%, for example, in the United Arab Emirates, look at that they will have a better life than their parents. But look at the right-hand side countries, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Iraq, all these countries that actually where youth went in to protest in 2019, they're all in that area, below 50, where they feel less and less optimistic and feel pretty depressed in terms of what's happening, So in many ways, these numbers bear out the fact that the Arab Spring has failed in this region. And if you go to the next and final slide, here we ask them, what is the biggest issue that's facing their day-to-day lives, and that's the rising cost of living across, including the oil-rich Gulf states. You can look 97% in Libya. And if you look at the conditions there, especially with the civil war still ongoing, you see cost of living becomes an extremely, it's a very, very difficult situation where youth unemployment, I fear, would be much, much higher than what the World Bank numbers are saying. So cause for concern, but yet I think youth by its nature is exuberant, it's optimistic. Certain parts of the region look at it very positively. This is what we captured in 2020, but where things are going in terms of, many of the conflicts, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Yemen, most of these theaters of conflict are actually slowing down, and there is much more peace coming into the region. The GCC met yesterday in Riyadh, and I think the old Qatar issue is also getting resolved. So I see a region that is moving towards a much more peaceful era, where governments could focus on building more resilient economies, being able to focus on managing the pandemic and bringing back the jobs for the young people. And I'm really hopeful that some of these numbers, while they look depressing, there is also a hope that the young will prevail, that the youth dividend that the region enjoys will pay back for bringing the Middle East back into the reckoning. I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I'd like to pass on to Amani Jamal if she's joined us. Kelsey, do you think Amani
yes, thank you so much, Sunil. That was wonderful. So I'm going to share my slides for the presentation and also share survey data from the region and keeping in the spirit. And I hope everybody can see my slides. Excellent. So I'll be presenting Arab Barometer data. Very briefly, just a little bit about the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer currently is one of the largest survey projects in the Arab world. Between 2009 to 2019, we've surveyed over 5 different waves in the region in 15 different countries, conducting about 50 national surveys and over 70,000 interviews with Arab citizens. We place a lot of our emphasis on data quality, and we work with our local partners on the ground to build regional capacity and develop software flags on suspicious interviews. So we're sort of trying to handle in-house issues that might be linked to data quality. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about that after the talk. So some of the key findings, similar to what Sunil just sort of emphasized, some of the key findings here is that the economy remains a key grievance among citizens of Middle East and North Africa, and it's a concern among all age groups. And while there are no age-driven differences on a regional level, they are pronounced in Jordan and Morocco. Unlike the economy, there are stark differences between younger and older generations in the desire to migrate, both regionally and particularly in Jordan, Morocco, and Egypt. Both age groups, however, are primarily motivated to migrate for economic reasons. The initially narrow gap between young and old and overt preferences for political expressions of religion has almost entirely closed since the Arab Spring. And I'll be showing you some slides here that will better capture this. But just briefly, I thought it was important to sort of capture where citizens in MENA stand in terms of their overall levels of education, especially when we think about dividing this up between the older cohort, which is 30 plus, and the younger cohort, 18 to 29, or what's the youth population. What we see by and large is that the Middle East is on this momentum moving forward in terms of citizens accessing higher education. And we see this particularly among the younger generation. I want to draw your attention to the right side here, where we break down the countries in the 5th wave by age cohort. And by and large, the story here is that the younger generation is more educated than their parents. We see this almost in every single country, for the exception of Kuwait. But nevertheless, levels of university education remain significant and on the rise in most countries. So I'll come back to this point in just a moment. When we look at this issue of religiosity and piety, I think, remember in the early days of the Arab Spring, there was a lot made in the media about that the Arab Spring was basically championed by a younger generation of youth that had become less religious and more liberal. Our data does not necessarily substantiate this. While we show that the older generation across most countries is more religious than the youth, what we show is that this has remained basically static throughout time. And this could just be basically an age or cohort difference in terms of religiosity, with older people finding religion later in their lives. But by and large, levels of religiosity among the youth have always hovered around 30% across the last decade. When we look at unemployment by age, here is where we see some very sort of concerning evidence, especially when we look at levels of education among the youth. They're on the rise, what we see here is that the labor market is not keeping up with the education achievements for the youth population. So here you see still the staggering levels of unemployment among the youth population. And anybody working on the Middle East and North Africa cannot ignore this big elephant in the room. So 67% of the youth are unemployed in Algeria, 62% in Morocco, 48% in Jordan, 40% in Palestine. This is a well-educated youth population. So again, this idea of the ceiling collapsing on the heads of the youth is very much part of the daily life of youth in the region. And it's no surprise then that the economic grievances are quite high. When we ask citizens in MENA, how would you evaluate the economies in your country? In no country other than Kuwait, which is a classic, oil rentier state, and no other country do citizens even reach close to 50%. Egypt, 41% say that the economy is doing very good or good. But look down here, Tunisia, the poster child of the Arab Spring, 7%. Say that the economy is doing well. Lebanon, 14%. Iraq, 21%. Jordan, 23%. Palestine, 24%. And when we look at this number across time, is that at the eve of the Arab Spring, the MENA average was about approximately a third for the adult population, a quarter for the youth population. Now that has fallen for the adult population to a quarter. So again, this economic situation, the economic problems in the region, with the regional instability, continued tensions within the region and externally, this is very disappointing for the youth and citizens of the region. And this is just breaking it down by country, but you'll see that the economic grievances are on the rise, or at least satisfaction with the current economies on the decline. And Sunil talked about this, but I just want to emphasize a point. This is a desire to immigrate. Again, the youth population, almost 50% of the youth population seeks to immigrate, would like to immigrate. It was about 46% right before the Arab Spring. Among the youth population, we saw a decline about 8 percentage points during the Arab Spring. So this idea that there might be some optimism around the Arab Spring, that the Arab Spring would bring better economic opportunities for the youth, so that this declined a little bit. And then now it's back at 46%. The adult population, we had about a third wanting to immigrate before the Arab Spring. That number is closer to 23%. We sort of internally believe that this is the Trump effect, with the restrictions and the Muslim ban sort of being a deterrent to the adult population to seek migration. And then we have data, I'd be happy to show it across countries, but more or less the story here is that the youth populations in each of these countries have more or less stayed pretty constant. So reasons for immigrating as well, just to hit this, in our survey, we broke it down along economic reasons and other reasons, plus political reasons, but economic reasons were the biggest concern for the Arab youth. And people who say that the desire to migrate. And we found that the economic reasons were similar across the cohorts, both adults and youth. Almost 60% said they would migrate for economic reasons. Just to talk about this issue of political Islam again, at the eve of the Arab Spring, there was more support for political Islam, around 46% among the adult population, 40% among the youth. That has declined across the last decade. We attribute it to the politics in the region, where, as many of you know, political Islamic parties have lost favor with the populations because of some of the Arab Spring developments. But nevertheless, when we ask citizens in the region, should the laws in your country be based entirely or mostly on Sharia, we see that this has remained to be a pretty popular stance among people across the region, with the youth at 37% saying yes, adults at 42%. Now, let me just make sure I point out that this is a very sort of subjective measure of Sharia, because in each country you have a Sharia code that is different. But nevertheless, this does sort of hint at the fact that across the region, there seems to be some sort of respect for Islamic, at least, not Islamic law per se, but at least like Islamic justification of the laws. So, so although support for political Islam is on the decline, there's still sort of this place for Islam in politics across the region. The other thing that we pay a lot of attention to is the idea of attitudes towards gender roles. One of the questions that we track is women and men should have equal rights in making the decision to divorce. And by and large, across the entire region, we see that this particular question has a lot of support in countries like Lebanon, Tunisia, Palestine, Libya. But in some of the more conservative countries like Kuwait, Egypt, Yemen, and Sudan, we find less support. But nevertheless, this attitude has remained constant. So we haven't necessarily seen this post-Arab Spring surge, at least on this issue regarding divorce. But when we ask people about can women become president or prime minister, what we see is, again, there's considerable support in most countries. Again, Yemen, Sudan, Kuwait, Algeria hover around the 50% or less. But this one, we do see modest gains across time. So increasingly across the Middle East and North Africa, we've seen more support for this, but it's not, it's remained pretty static among the adult population. So we haven't seen much movement among the adult population, but we do see about a 10 percentage point difference in the youth population. Views on democracy. This is also a set of questions that we rigorously monitor in the Arab Barometer. So one of the questions we ask is a country's economy weak under democracy? And what we basically see here is that about a third of the population, both youth and adults, agree that a country's economy is weak under democracy. And we see that this has remained static across time for most of the Middle East and North Africa. But when we look at Tunisia, which is again our poster child, our what I call the Cinderella story of the Arab Spring in terms of the one successful democratic transition, what we see here is that at the eve of the Arab Spring, only 21% of adults, 15% of youth said that economies are weak under democracies. By 2019, last year, among the youth, 43% say the economy is weak under democracy, and 43% of the adults say the economy is weak. So the number has doubled among the adult population, and then 38% of the youth say the economy is weak. So the number has almost it's almost 250% more over the last decade. So people are losing faith in democracy's ability to address economic conditions. And just to step back, when we ask people in our open-ended questions, what does democracy mean for you, or what would you like to see come out of democracy? Most people will respond that the issue is economic justice and economic opportunities, not only political rights and civil and political liberties. So just to keep this in mind. Another question we ask here is, are democratic systems effective or not effective? The percent that say that democracies are not effective across the region is about a third. That has remained static. But look here, again, in Tunisia, the numbers have grown significantly in terms of citizens believing across the last decade that democracies are not effective. And the youth are slightly more skeptical of democracies than the adult population. And then finally, democratic systems are better than other systems by age group. Most people still believe across MENA that regardless of all these economic problems, democracies are still more suitable than other political systems. But look, in Tunisia, we see that the youth population is on the decline in terms of supporting this opinion. They believe that democratic systems are less likely to believe that democratic systems are better than other forms of systems across the 10 years. So we're seeing some loss of confidence there among the youth population. Again, the other issue to keep our eye on is government satisfaction across most of the Middle East and North Africa is down since the Arab Spring. And it's down equally among both adults and the youth, with the youth being less satisfied with government performance here. And then finally, in terms of everyday, what we call ordinary political efficacy, we ask people, to what extent are you interested in politics? While Palestinians remain the most interested in politics, and that's because probably of their daily realities surrounding occupation and issues with the PA, we find that in no country more than a third of the population says it's interested in politics. But what we're tracking here on the right is the trend since the Arab Spring. While 37% of the youth said that they were interested in politics in 2009, a decade later, only 24% are interested in politics. So we see a growing level of political apathy there, but we also see growing level of political apathy among the adult population as well. We had about 45% say that they were interested in politics in 2009. Today, that's closer to 28%. So about a decline of 20 percentage points there among the adult population. So in terms of portraying the picture, what we see is that there was some optimism around the Arab Spring in terms of democracy, in terms of economic opportunities. The reality of the situation is that the economic situations have not mirrored or have not even come close to where the citizen expectations have been. As a result, support and enthusiasm for democracy is on the decline. And the other thing that we keep our eyes on, a lot of feminist scholars are watching, is regardless of what's going on in the economic and political sphere, do we see advancements on women's rights? We see some advancements there, but we're definitely something to keep our eye out. A lot of scholarship also indicates when there's a lot of fierce competition in the labor market, that does not bode well for women's and female empowerment more generally. So it's something to keep our eyes on as we move forward. But I will end here and I'll turn it over to my colleague and mentor, Dr. Shibli Tilhami.
Thank you so much. Thank you for two excellent presentations, and thank you to the Baker Institute for hosting this. It's a place that I have a soft spot for, including for its leadership, and I've been watching all the excellent work that the Institute has been doing. As was said in the introduction, certainly I have done a lot of public opinion polls, including a full decade before the Arab uprising started, and wrote a book on that particular issue. But what I don't want to give you more data, because we've had two sets of data and I don't want to revisit the same. I'm not even going to be using slides. Instead, what I thought I'd do in the few minutes that I have is to provide something of a macro picture to place where this public opinion is coming from, what are the trends that are taking place in the region, how to interpret them, and how to interpret public opinion in the context of what's taken place. Let me just start by saying what we're seeing right now is really, I think, internal and transnational counter-revolution efforts by insecure ruling elites who have gained the upper hand for now. And it's important to understand that dynamic because it bears on where the public is and where public opinion is. And it also bears on the events that have followed the start of the Arab uprisings in 2011. It's also important to keep in mind that they're really not just the Arab uprisings that have impacted the thinking in the region, particularly among ruling elites, among the rulers across the region, and the publics as well. But also another set of facts that's related is the 2003 Iraq war that has a lot of impact in driving the insecurities of regimes in the region. Of course, authoritarian regimes are always insecure up to a point. But I think what we have seen in the past decade is something unprecedented. And it is driven not only by the impact of the Arab uprisings that have threatened regimes across the region, but also by the Iraq war. And I'll just mention a few things related to that Iraq war to put it in perspective about the insecurities. First, that the Iraq War certainly brought Al-Qaeda and Daesh into the doorsteps of the Arab world. Remember, Al-Qaeda, while some of its leaders originated in the Middle East, was operating out of Afghanistan, didn't really have operation bases in the region. The Iraq War and the collapse of Central Authority brought them to the region and producing unprecedented threat to neighboring countries, not just to Iraq itself. The second is that the Iraq War ended the balance of power between Iran and Iraq, which was a cornerstone of Gulf security. Regimes felt that there were two basic things that protected them in their strategy, given that they're weak and wealthy at the same time. One was to maintain a balance of power between Iraq and Iran as a way of stabilizing the region. And the second is depending on American forces and presence as part of their strategy of defending themselves. Both of these collapsed after the Iraq War. The first, obviously, because of the end of the balance of power between Iran and Iraq, and really Iraq ceasing to be a state that could be counted on in that regard. And the second is that you had the United States, following the Iraq War, lost its appetite for presence and wars in the region in a way that actually scared a lot of regimes in the region. And so they began devising different strategies for themselves, including interventionist strategies, the likes of which they hadn't pursued before as a way of protecting themselves. And then you have the Arab uprisings. And the Arab uprisings, starting with Tunisia and Egypt, the toppling of Mubarak particularly, who had been seen as an anchor, both in Egypt and regionally, frightened particularly the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, in ways that have led them to be more aggressive in their strategy in the region, because they realized not only that this could happen to them at home, but also that the forces were somewhat transnational. We saw how things started in Tunisia, went to Egypt, Libya, and so forth. There was a transnational element that threatened them as well, and therefore they needed not only to protect themselves at home, but also in some ways to invest in regional efforts to bring about outcomes that are more conducive to their own security. So I think this has to be understood, even regardless of what happened since the Arab uprisings. But I want to say how the Arab uprisings, in a way, were misunderstood initially and how to look at them now. I think that when you look at the uprisings themselves, most of us have argued that they were enabled by a public empowerment that was in turn enabled by the information revolution that eroded regime ability to control the narrative, and at the same time provided some tools of organizing to the public that took governments by surprise. That dimension of the Arab uprising has not disappeared, because the information revolution, in fact, did erode government's ability to control the narrative and did provide means of organizing for the public. The 2011 wasn't unique because suddenly Arabs were angry with the governments. Arabs had been angry with the governments for decades. And in fact, those of us political scientists are asking the question, how is it that Arabs haven't revolted yet? Not why Arabs, why there's been revolution in the Arab world. There hasn't been. So this was more about the means rather than about some new events that have driven people to act. That hasn't changed, but what has changed is our perceptions. And I want to say that I wrote, in my concluding chapter, The World Through Arab Eyes, which I wrote the year after the uprising started in 2012. In the concluding chapter, I made several points about why the Arab uprising shouldn't be misunderstood. That while they were in fact about Arab public empowerment in ways that we had not witnessed in the past, we witnessed that obviously in the streets of capitals in the Arab world, especially Tunisia and Egypt at the time, that empowerment itself cannot be understood to be the only force. It's a new and important force, but it has to be weighed against a lot of other things. And that the fact that you have uprising, the public is contesting power, it doesn't mean that the only game is between publics and governments. So I want to make 4 points here, actually 5 points related to the dynamics that we have to understand that drove the relationship between publics, public opinion, governments, and ruling elites. The first, I think, well, certainly a dimension of the Arab uprisings was governments revolting against, people revolting against the governments with the slogans like dignity, which I think is a central and genuine driving force with all that it implies, and freedom as well. All people want that. But beyond that, people don't necessarily want the same thing, and they don't want the same thing in the same way. And so it was inevitable that aside from wanting government to change, or want to say changing the system, that the degree of division within states was going to be a huge factor. And so therefore, where there are more divisions within the state, you're going to see contention within society itself, among people themselves, not just between people and governments. And governments are going to likely exploit that, as happens everywhere. I mean, look at, for example, how we are a democracy and supposedly the greatest democracy on earth, and see what happened with our identity politics, where a president, even despite our free press seemingly out there to counter the narratives, how a president who's elected democratically can manipulate divisions and public opinion in a way to play on identity politics and allow those divisions to reduce the pressure on himself coming from people. So imagine if that's true of our great democracy, what can happen in other countries. And obviously the degrees of those divisions depend on ethnic, religious, ideological divisions. It doesn't have to be ethnic, as in Syria. Obviously in Syria is a perfect example, because there was public against government, but obviously we saw also it's a sectarian conflict. And then in addition, once the central authority weakens or collapses, you start having external intervention into the state, in part because everybody wants an outcome that reduces the impact on them. So we see that Gulf states interfere, Turkey interfere, Iran interfere, Israel interfere, Hezbollah interfere. That's something that was almost inevitable, the result of the weakening of central authority and the surfacing of the internal divisions. Even if people want the government to be changed. Second is the distribution of resources within the state and across the region matters a lot. We've seen, particularly in the case of the Gulf states, not only how they buffered themselves. The Saudis initially wrote checks to their public to buffer themselves from immediate anger, but then starting to use checks to dictate the outcome of other countries, as happened in Egypt, for example, to solicit an outcome that is more stabilizing to them. And third, the role of the military in society. We've seen how, public opinion aside, and most of the outcomes were somewhat dependent on what role the military played and the role of military generally in society. In Egypt, the military was dominant throughout from day one until the end. It never really left. In Tunisia, it stepped aside and played a different kind of role. In Syria, it was an instrument of the regime. So we have seen the roles of military in society was absolutely a factor. Fourth, because the path of change is not linear, it never is. Read, political science literature on transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. It's unpredictable, it's nonlinear, it goes up and down. And because of that, there are always costs associated with the transition because it's destabilizing. And then the fact that it's destabilizing scares people. So for example, a the Jordanian king can tell his people, do you want Damascus or do you want Amman? Because look at what happened in Damascus do you want Yemen or do you want Amman, and so forth. So that's one reason why when Sunil was reading his public opinion about what's important to people, dignity versus stability, jobs, whatever, rulers can use this. Obviously, this factor to impact people's assessment of what they want and affects the will to revolt, at least in the short term. And finally, the point on information revolution. I said the information revolution, whether it's the satellite television like Al Jazeera or social media, was hugely impactful for public empowerment. But of course, those who are in power learn that too. So it's a learning game for both. The public learns how to use it, but then those who are threatened by it use resources to control it. We've seen part of the debate, it was mentioned, the conflict between Qatar and the rest. A huge part of it was Al Jazeera, because the Arab governments did feel threatened by Al Jazeera, and they think they can control it. They think they can control information revolution. They're investing hundreds of millions of dollars on software and hiring internet companies to control the narratives on the internet because they see it as a threat. So that's a war that's ongoing because governments also learn how to use that. When I look at it and I see this ongoing game between ruling elites and the public in an unfolding environment where the information revolution continues to evolve and the political environment, strategic environment continues to evolve, I don't see this phase as a phase of stability and economic progress for years to come. I see it just another phase in a cycle of ups and downs. And I think the game is far from over. The empowerment of the public is real. The information revolution is with us. It'll evolve in different ways. The public voice will be heard. Governments will be threatened again. And I think this is just another phase where the governments for now have gained the upper hand. The public is tired, but it's only a phase. I'll end with that.
Thank you so much, Shibli. Thank you to all our panelists for these comments. We don't have so much time, unfortunately, to address all the audience questions, but I'm just going to take a couple and direct them pointedly to speakers based on some of the comments that you made during your presentations. So for Sunil and Amani, one comment asks about this support or lack thereof for democracy. And I think both of your presentations emphasize that primary concerns since 2011 up until now have been on the failure of governments to produce sort of economic reforms or a better economic situation and better opportunities, especially as Amani emphasized, for a very highly educated youth population. This audience member asks, could the reason for a lack of interest or support for democracy reflect the fact that they've never seen democracy? They have no interest in politics because they don't have elections, or those that do have elections control the opinions or the options, of candidates. So could you speak a bit to this sort of depoliticized youth and looking both at the failure to produce economic opportunities, but also some of the consequences of the 2011 uprisings in terms of increased repression or limited opportunities for political participation? So let me just ask also, I'm gonna ask Shibli if he could please comment on, since you began your presentation discussing American foreign policy with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. If you could comment on this question from an audience member, which says that several commentators have said that Biden will again cement liberal values as a core component of US foreign policy. How important is this to young people in the region, and how would they define liberal values? So obviously there hasn't been public opinion data on this yet, presumably because we just had this election, but can we expect anything different from a Biden administration, and what might that mean to residents in the region, I guess in particular youth? So if we could go in the order of the speakers originally, so Sunil, if you could comment, and then Amani and Shibli.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that the person asked on whether young people are interested in democracy because they never experienced it. Fair question. But the truth of it is, who is defining democracy? Democracy as defined by the Western world, or democracy as seen by the Arab youth protesting on the streets? The truth of the matter is the people in the squares out there protesting during 2011 or even in 2019, they were not primarily agitating for democracy as such. They wanted dramatically better governance. They wanted, and failing that, they wanted these unresponsive or corrupt regimes to leave. And that's what they succeeded in 2011. They succeeded in well-entrenched regimes that when they tasted success. But then what happened after that is a completely different story. So I think it's important to know that the young people, they want to be part of how they are governed. I feel, while I've said earlier that the Arab Spring has actually not produced the results, I think young people will have a say in the matter because the issues are becoming red hot. And if they will not be allowed to, they won't have these opportunities to emigrate. So what they're going to do in the country is to be able to change things, for themselves, whether not depend on the government, but create more opportunities for themselves through enterprise. And that's what we are seeing in some of the numbers as well. So to answer the question, are the youth interested in democracy? No, not as defined by the Western world, but they will be a key component of how the new Middle East emerges in the next decade, for sure.
Thank you, Sunil. So just to answer that question, so I often get this question about what citizens in the region believe in, especially because of the histories of their countries. And as Shibli mentioned, in an era of widespread globalization and social media access, it's not lost on ordinary citizens in the region how other citizens in the world are enjoying or not enjoying their political and economic freedoms and rights. So there's when you survey citizens, when you talk to them, when you interview them, there is wide understanding about what it means to live in a democracy in terms of not only political rights, but also economic justice. And the fact is, when we look at it with it from a comparative politics perspective, there's a very strong correlation between democracies and economic development. So the idea that citizens in the region believe that democracy should also get them to a better economic situation is not complete, is very, very much grounded in the empirical reality of democracies worldwide. But I do believe that the loss of political interest or increasing levels of heightened levels of political apathy have more to do with the political situation in the regions and what you do see. And it's not sort of like, a negative kind of like, citizens in the regions are lacking political interest. That's not what we're trying to get across. I think Sunil and Shibli are also trying to make this point, is that given the events of the last decade, which were not only linked to the Arab Spring, but you had very heightened expectations around the Arab Spring. You've had all this external intervention in the region. None of it led to better economic and political opportunities for citizens. What we saw are basically countries vying for their own control and their own economic interest at the expense of the economic well-being of citizens in the region. And then political leaderships in Arab countries basically almost complicit in this. It really sort of deflates the political aptitude of citizens across the region, both the youth and the adult population. I mean, where do they turn to? If the political leadership is more interested in other priorities than enhancing the well-being of the populations, if the international community, for all the talk about the importance of democracy in the Middle East, under Obama and under Trump, I mean, so, it's not that we had this, things were so much better under Democratic administrations and then we had Trump and things got worse. Yes, things got worse under Trump, but they were never necessarily better under that much better under Democratic administrations. by and large, the number one priority is order, stability, and security, access to oil, containing Iran, ensuring, maintaining our ties to Israel. The citizens are lost in this equation. And what we see now is that there is a lot of political apathy because of that, and a wide-scale disappointment. And we know when you have wide-scale disappointment, I know I've gone over time, I want to turn to Shibli. When we have wide-scale disappointment among such large segments of the population, this does not bode well.
I'm scared of the dark. Whoops, Shibli, you're mute.
Sorry, did I?
If I may first also address the question of democracy, in part because I want to put back on my pollster hat, because I've done so much polling on this issue in the Arab world. And we had question about that in the Arab world. So one of the questions I had for many years prior to the Arab uprising, which is name the countries that you think are most democratic in the world and where they have most freedom for their people. And guess what? Most of the countries they selected, Western European countries and the US, they selected before the Arab uprising. So you can say they don't know what democracy is or what freedom is, but the fact is they associated, when you ask them, they associated with Western democracy, no doubt about that. But then when we asked in 2012, what kind of system would you like to have? It was closer to what their perception of Turkey was at that time. And now I think Turkey's model eroded in part because of its role in Syria and confrontation with a number of Arab states. But at the time, Turkey was emerging as something that looked like a somewhat democratic, economically successful, Islamic culture. That's a combination, even though Turkey was not named as one of the top democracies in the world. So they were obviously looking for a compromise model where there is a certain compromise between a relative democracy, relative economic prosperity, relative responsiveness to their culture. That's what people are looking for. And so it's not, but they know what democracy means, even if they have not lived it. With regard to Biden, the Arab public never really thought the US is the best agent for democratizing in the Arab world. They just don't trust it. They haven't trusted it, no matter who was in power, whether it was Obama or whether it was Clinton or whether it was Bush. They never thought it could be brought about by American intervention. But nonetheless, there is a perception of the US, and it was the power of example. Again, when you ask, name the countries that have most freedom and democracy for their people, the US was one of the top 5 people always mentioned, as were Western Europe. That was the power of the example. And the power of the example has eroded dramatically, particularly on the Trump clock. I mean, I don't need to tell you how the reports sound when the president of the United States says we have the most corrupt election in the history of the world, basically, nothing worse than the third world. So I don't think people are expecting Biden to come and champion their cause, but they do expect the US to lead by example. And in that regard, I think standing up for human rights, speaking out, being disciplined by being responsive to international organizations, international law, international norms. That's what people expect. That's what people want. And hopefully Biden will be somewhat more responsive to that.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to all the panelists for your insightful comments. I really appreciate you taking the time with us today, and thank you to our audience members for asking great questions. If you're interested, or you maybe have a colleague who wasn't able to attend, but they're interested in seeing this presentation, it will be available on YouTube and on our Baker Institute website. And if you're interested in joining us next week, we're going to have a second follow-up webinar looking more at international relations and changing alliances as a result of the 2011 uprisings. So please join us again next week. And thank you again to everyone who participated. Take care.
Bye-bye.